good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out on this cold but fortunately not rainy night, as I enjoyed yesterday. I am delighted. I've been lucky enough to speak here before in the past, and it's a great privilege and to do that, and I'm delighted to be back with another 17th century topic. The other time was about, I think, Jan Lievens. And it's a little bit 17th century, a little bit 20th century topic. And I had thought originally that I would give a broader discussion of the Van Meegeren Affair, the impact of the Van Meegeren Affair, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, on Vermeer studies. But the topic got too large, and so I have decided to focus my discussion on this one painting, the impact of the Van Meegeren Affair and the appreciation and attribution of Vermeer's Women Seated at a Virginal in the Leiden Collection. Our knowledge of women seated at a virginal dates to 1904, when the renowned German art historian Wilhelm Bode, who's seen on the right, published it in the catalog of the collection of Alfred Beit on the left, a Hamburg-born mining magnate living in London. Bode commented that even this small painting, even in this small painting, one can appreciate how Vermeer's wonderful distribution of light and the exquisite harmony of color produces masterpieces of the utmost delicacy of tone. This opinion held sway for over 40 years. Then, in 1945-47, a tsunami occurred in Vermeer scholarship when Han van Meegeren confessed that he, not Vermeer, had painted the recently discovered Supper at Emmaus, then viewed as one of Vermeer's greatest masterpieces. And this is the painting, the Supper at Emmaus, and this is Van Meegeren on the left, the two images, Van Meegeren standing at the top, and a view of the courtroom in Amsterdam in 1947 when he was being tried. Now, I'll go back, you'll see more of this later on. Although young woman seated at the virginal was not discussed in the ensuing Van Meegeren trial in 1947 after the confession in 1945, Dutch scholars subsequently questioned its attribution, as well as that of other Vermeer paintings. And here I will recount the history of Vermeer forgeries in the early 20th century and the reasons Van Meegeren's admission were so consequential for Vermeer studies and specifically for this work. Rehabilitating the correctness of an attribution is actually rather complicated, and it's taken time, a lot of time. But with evidence gained from technical studies and conservation treatments, its rightful place in Vermeer's canon has fortunately been reestablished. A sense of the euphoria surrounding Johannes Vermeer's name in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is evident in the enthusiastic words of Etienne Touré-Berger, the French writer and collector who did more than anyone else to turn the world's attention to the artist. In the introduction to his 1866 article on Vermeer in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, Touré-Berger addresses his reader in a remarkably personal manner, encouraging them to think as he. And he writes, "You are among those who are attracted to the unknown or the misknown. You are all at once curious of the mystery and reality of shadow and light, the two extremities of art and life." And then he focused on the core issue. Vandermeer did not die, and that is because what he created is still here, but his name has been effaced from his resplendent paintings. Touré-Berger described his own first encounter of this unknown artist in the following manner. In the museum in The Hague, a superb and most unusual landscape captures the attention of every visitor, artist, and connoisseur. Not knowing the artist, I consulted the catalog. View of the town of Delft beside a canal by Han van Meegeren of Delft. Amazing. Here is someone of whom we know nothing in France and who deserves to be known. Later, Thorbecke wrote, I also had the opportunity of visiting the private collection of Monsieur Six van Hillegom. There I found two more extraordinary paintings, a servant pouring milk and the facade of a Dutch home by Han van Meegeren of Delft, astonishing painter. But after Rembrandt and Frans Hals, is this Van der Meer of Delft then one of the foremost masters of the entire Dutch school? How was it that no one knew anything of the artist, my Sphinx of Delft? My Sphinx, Van der Meer. Thorbecke writes that his obsession with Vermeer caused him in considerable expense. To see one picture by Van der Meer, I traveled hundreds of miles. I even retraced my steps all around Germany, but I was amply recompensed, more especially as I had the pleasure not only of admiring the works in museums, but in acquiring more than a dozen for my friends and others for myself. And these are three of the paintings that he had acquired: woman standing at the Virginal in the National Gallery in London, the geographer in Frankfurt, and the girl reading with its pearl necklace in Berlin. The passion Thorbecke felt for Vermeer was contagious and was shared by collectors and art lovers in Europe and America, who were increasingly willing to pay enormous sums for rare treasures painted by the Delft master. It should be noted, however, that Thorbecke was not always correct in his attributions. An artist that confounded him was Jacob Vrel, whose initials were JV. Even the woodcut illustration in the Torres Gazette des Beaux-Arts article on Vermeer is based on a Vrel painting, and that of Vermeer. So that painting on the right is very similar to what his illustration is, and that's a painting in Vienna. The confusion about the character and limits of Vermeer's small oeuvre, thus, did not begin with forgeries produced in the 20th century, but it was already well established in the 19th century. Esme Quadbach, who has written about Willem Bode and Vermeer, notes that in the spring of 1868, when Bode was a young lawyer on the right, pursuing his interest in art and helping arrange paintings in Braunschweig's Ducal Palace Gallery, he met Thorbecke when the French Vermeer enthusiast was on his trip through Germany. Bode, who guided Thorbecke through the picture gallery, would certainly have led Vermeer to the Vermeer's painting there, The Girl with the Wine Glass, on the left, obviously. Bode soon abandoned his law profession and began his steady rise as one of the world's leading art experts, particularly for Rembrandt, but also for Vermeer. Bode subsequently traveled widely through Europe and the United States, often with the hope of persuading clients like Alfred Beit, whom he also advised to acquire Lady writing a letter with her maid, which is a painting now in Dublin, to donate paintings to the Berlin museums, where he had become director. In his 1913 Beit catalog, Bode reflected upon Vermeer's burgeoning reputation in the early years of the 20th century, particularly in America. He noted that in America, a Vermeer is more prized than a Raphael or a Rembrandt, and his small pictures command high prices as high as works by these masters. Bode, who traveled to America in 1893 and 1911, was extremely impressed with the quality of Vermeer paintings in the collections of Isabella Stewart Gardner. And here's the painting of the concert, which has unfortunately been stolen, but that was there when he was there. J. Pierpont Morgan, Henry Clay Frick, and Peter A.B. Widener, and Morgan bought the lady writing a letter, yellow writing a letter, and Widener, the Woman of the Balance, both of which are currently in the National Gallery. In the 1920s and 1930s were exciting decades for the discovery and appreciation of Vermeer, not just in America, but also in Europe. This was, however, a period when ambitiously attributed paintings and forgeries were entering the art market, not only because of Vermeer's appeal to contemporary taste, but also because of the extremely high prices his rare works were starting to command. In their eagerness to expand Vermeer's oeuvre, many scholars, even Willem Bode, accepted dubious works attributed to Vermeer that suddenly appeared on the market. Contemporary art historians, including one of Bode's proteges, Willem Valentiner, recognized the possibilities for deception posed by this unique historical moment. But as Valentiner wrote in 1928, when he published two recently discovered works, The Smiling Girl and The Lace Maker, he was confident that experts could distinguish between real and fake Vermeer paintings. So Valentiner wrote in 1928, to hear almost every year of a newly discovered Vermeer may cause suspicion. Paintings have often been associated with his name, which cannot stand serious criticism. The mistakes in attribution are made by those who persuade themselves that the artist might have once varied from his usual path and developed in other directions, but he did not. Vermeer used a very small number of models and repeated certain details like costumes, curtains, pillows, so often that newly discovered works by him frequently seem like puzzle pictures composed of pieces taken from different paintings. Ironically, of course, the recently discovered Smiling Girl and Lace Makers that Valentine discussed in his article were forgeries and not authentic Vermeers. Nevertheless, Valentine's assessment of the historical situation and Vermeer's working method, while astute, also underscores his arrogance in believing that he could distinguish forgeries and pastiches from Vermeer's original works of art. And this is the type of thing that Vermeer actually, the forgers did, which is exactly what Valentina said Vermeer did, which was to take poses like the lace maker, the forgery in the middle, the pose is based on the lady in yellow writing a letter. Look at her hands in the National Gallery. And the theme, of course, is from the painting of the lace maker in the Louvre. And the Smiling Girl is the same kind of connections. The smiling woman looks very much like the painting in Braunschweig, which Bode knew well. The Smiling Girl and the Lace Maker were likely executed in the studio of Theo van Wijngaarden, who is on the right in this slide. A painter, restorer, dealer, and it would seem forger who lived and worked in The Hague during the 1920s and 1930s. Van Wijngaarden made a practice and perhaps a living of searching out old canvases in junk shops, restoring them, selling them for a profit. For Van Wijngaarden, restorations meant anything from cleaning and retouching to adding signatures to repainting the entire image. Van Wijngaarden was a friend of Van Meegeren, who is here on the left. And even though Van Meegeren never acknowledged that he had anything to do with the Smiling Girl and the Lace Maker, as Jonathan Lopez has argued, he may well have painted them for Van Wijngaarden's forgery operation. Both forgeries were painted on reused canvases, and this is from technical studies we did at the National Gallery, where these paintings currently are. Both forgeries were painted on reused canvases in which portions of the ground and paint layers had been partially scraped away. The craquelure in these layers helped induce the appearance of aged crackle in the new paint. The medium the forger used, a combination of oil and protein/glue emulsion, resists the action of organic solvents, which were applied to test for the age of the paint. Glue emulsion also shrinks when it dries, enhancing the semblance of aged craquelure. In 1981, I met and spoke with the Dutch painter Henricus Roll. who was a friend and colleague of both Theo van Wijngaarden and Han van Meegeren. Although Roll claimed that he did not know that anything about forgeries were made, he allowed that he had heard that forgers would dry their paintings quickly in the sun and then would enhance the crackle pattern by pressing them against a beach ball. To make the cracks look old, they would dissolve licorice, Dutch love licorice, as you know, in water and brush it over the painting, and then wipe the surface clean, but the licorice would stay in the cracks. Roll said that he, Van Wijngaarden, and Van Meegeren frequented each other's homes and shared a passion for chess, which they often played. As a memento of their friendship, Roll asked Van Wijngaarden and his wife to sign an album, Amicorum, which also included photographs, signatures, birth dates, and even thumbprints. And up in the upper left, the two top signatures on the left are the Van Wijngaardens, husband and wife. Another signature of interest is over here. So this is the Van Wijngaarden. Is dated October 17th, 1935, and it is another chess friend, Harold R. Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, whom Boll described as an Englishman involved in the manufacture of paints. Forging a Vermeer is one thing, marketing it is another. The key to acceptance was to gain the approval of a major authority in the field. In the case of these two forgeries, the authority would be Willem Bode. Van Wijngaarden / Van Meegeren found two willing individuals to take these recently discovered paintings, the Smiling Girl and the Lace Maker, to Berlin to show to Bode. The individual who presented the Lace Maker to Bode was none other than Harold R. Wright, the chess buddy. He was not really a collector so much as a friend of the forgers. Bode was so taken by the painting that against all precedent, he offered to exhibit it at the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. Bode wrote, quote, "In honor of a Vermeer, especially of one that has never been known, we shall be glad to make an exception." The dealer, Joseph Devine, soon acquired both Vermeer paintings, quote-unquote Vermeer paintings, and sold them to Andrew Mellon. And this is Andrew Mellon on the left, this is Devine in the middle, and Devine and Mellon on the right. In 1937, Mellon donated both of these works, and as well, Vermeer's Girl, the Red Hat, which he had acquired in 1925, to the National Gallery, where I later served as a curator. After Bode's death in 1929, forgers of Vermeer paintings sought approval from other experts, the most important of whom was another of Bode's former disciples, Abraham Bredius. Bredius, like Bode, had a worldwide reputation as an expert on Dutch art. He was very knowledgeable about Vermeer as well, having once owned Vermeer's Allegory of the Catholic Faith here at the Met, and having acquired The Girl with the Pearl Earring when he was the director of the Maurits House. In 1922, Bode had retired to Monaco, but even there, Vermeer, in quotes, paintings were brought to him to authenticate. In 1932, Bredius wrote that, quote, fakers had found a happy hunting ground for their activities in Vermeer's, quote, brief and broken catalog, adding that no end of forgeries had lately been submitted to him for expertising. Indeed, the Vermeer craze in the Netherlands reached new heights in the 1930s. In 1935, Dirk Hanema, director of the Museum Boymans in Rotterdam, organized the first ever exhibition devoted to the Delft master to celebrate the opening of the museum's new building. Although the show was an enormous success, some scholars, including the young Vermeer expert A.B. de Vries, questioned the attributions of several of the paintings. Among the attributions de Vries questioned was Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, which Hahnemann believed belonged to Vermeer's little-known early period when he would have been painting religious subjects. Later in 1935, de Vries helped organize a smaller exhibition of paintings, Vermeer exhibition of paintings at the Rijksmuseum, where he was an assistant, but notably did not include this questionable work in the Rijksmuseum show. During the decade of the 1930s, the most dramatic event in the Vermeer world occurred in 1937, when Abraham Bredius published an enthusiastic article in the Burlington magazine about an heretofore unknown Vermeer painting, The Supper at Emmaus. And I read you a bit of that article, which you can see above there above the depiction of the painting. It is a wonderful moment in the life of a lover of art when he finds himself suddenly confronted with a hitherto unknown painting by a great master, untouched and on original canvas without any restorations, just as it left the painter's studio. And what a picture. Neither the beautiful signature nor the pointillé of the bread on the bread which Christ is blessing is necessary to convince me that we have here, I am inclined to say, the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft, and moreover, one of his largest works. And he is quite long, but at the end he writes, in no other painting by the great master of Delft do we find such sentiments, such a profound understanding of the Bible story, a sentiment so nobly human expressed through the medium of the highest art. Bredius concluded that Vermeer painted Supper at Emmaus early in his career, exactly the type of painting that Dirk Hahnemann and other scholars have been eager to find. After having seen the Supper at Emmaus, Bredius wrote immediately to Hahnemann that he was in ecstasy with what he saw. Hahnemann pledged to do everything possible to acquire the painting for the Boymans. Abraham Bredius first encountered the Supper at Emmaus in early September 1937, when Gerard Boon, a well-respected lawyer and member of the Dutch lower house, brought this unknown painting to him in Monaco. Boon told Bredius the painting came from an estate near The Hague. However, Boon's story was total fiction. Like Harold Wright, Boon was a middleman for marketing the forgery for Han van Meegeren. Van Meegeren, who had moved to southern France in 1932, possibly to be near Bredius, apparently had painted it between 1932 and 1935. In southern France, Van Meegeren had worked diligently on ways to create forgeries that could avoid detection. As in forgeries created in the Van Wijngaarden studio, Van Meegeren scraped down compositions of old paintings. He was careful to use the types of blues and yellows that were associated with Vermeer's painting techniques. Most significantly, Van Meegeren began using a quick-drying distemper called bakelite as his medium. The advantage of bakelite was that it dried quickly and became as hard as old oil paint. Van Meegeren developed this. How he developed this knowledge is not known, or is not certain, but it may have come from Harold R. Wright, his old chess buddy, who was a director of an international paint company in Germany, where developments of alternatives to oil paint were being developed. Bredius, in his efforts to save the Supper at Emmaus for the Dutch nation, contacted the Dutch ministry to ask whether, and this is very interesting, a generous donor might receive a decoration if he acquired a painting for a Dutch museum. The Boymans, with no little drama, found a donor and acquired the painting from the Gallery Hogendijk in Amsterdam. After the Supper at Emmaus was shipped to Rotterdam, the paintings, and here you have a picture of the painting with Hahnemann in the foreground and his restorer next to him. So it was shipped to Rotterdam. Hahnemann, the restorer, tested the painting's age, rejuvenated the varnish layer, and carefully relined it, but did no other conservation work. As emphasized by Friso Lammerts in his wonderful book on Van Meegeren, and particularly on the Supper of Emmaus, the announcement on February 17, 1938, that the Boymans Museum had acquired Supper of Emmaus was greeted with thunderous applause. The acquisition took on national significance, and its purchase was celebrated for saving, quote, saving this irreparable masterpiece for a people. Implication being that it would otherwise be acquired by a rich American collector. Beyond saving a national treasure, the acquisition had great significance for the Boymans. It was the sole major Dutch museum lacking a Vermeer painting. And here are some images of the ones, two at the Mauritshuis, the View of Delft, and the woman with the pearl earring, and then the Rijksmuseum, among their paintings, the Milkmaid and the Little Street, which you've seen before. To celebrate the acquisition, Hahnemann organized a major acquisition that summer, where the Supper of Emmaus was featured on the catalog's cover. The painting was specifically displayed behind a 17th century Dutch table and an oriental rug. The painting quickly became the most popular work in the Boymans Museum and, quote, a place of pilgrimage for many art lovers. A.B. de Vries, who I've mentioned earlier, published his influential catalogue raisonné of Vermeer's paintings in 1939, shortly after Bredius had discovered Supper of Emmaus. De Vries wrote, and after the Boymans had acquired it, de Vries prominently featured the painting in his monograph and described it as a wonder of the art of painting. Significantly, almost simultaneously with his publication, the Supper of Emmaus was removed from the walls of the Boymans Museum. The painting was packed in a wooden crate and taken to an air raid shelter because of the threat of war. The Supper of Emmaus, with its aura of being a great a great Vermeer masterpiece fully intact, would not be seen in public again or be able to be compared to other Vermeers until it was shown at Van Meegeren's trial in Amsterdam in October 1947. So that's from 1939 to 1947. It is totally out of sight. Van Meegeren went to trial because he had been arrested in May 1945, immediately after World War II, when authorities discovered that he had sold a Vermeer painting, Christ and the Woman Taken in Adultery, to the Nazi field marshal, Hermann Goering. And this is the painting on the right, and this is the way it appeared when the authorities were going through Goering's possessions on the lower left. And that's Goering walking out of the Houtsticker Gallery, which was a gallery taken over by the Nazis, and the gallery from which the Christ and the Woman Adultery was sold to Goering. So it all ties together. To sell a work of national heritage to the Germans was regarded as collaboration with the enemy, and it carried severe penalties. During his interrogations, Van Meegeren realized that he would be charged with a lesser offense if he admitted to having sold the forgery to Goering rather than an original Vermeer. Consequently, he confessed that he had not only forged Christ and the Woman Taken in Adultery, but also 5 other Vermeers, including Supper of Emmaus. Van Meegeren's confession came as a thunderbolt to the Dutch populace, who regarded him both as a hero for selling a forgery to Goering and as well as a villain for painting the beloved Supper of Emmaus. Revelations about Vermeer's forgeries were featured in newspaper headlines throughout the country. And you can, now I'm standing where I can't really see it, but I know that they say this 5 million guilders for 6 false Vermeers, and how Van Meegeren took all the experts for a ride on his forgeries, and they have a whole block on the left here. This is blown up here in the middle. That describe all the authorities and what they said about this painting and how wonderful it was. The first one being Bradius, the second one being de Vries. So it really is going through, it is giving a lot of crap to all the Dutch authorities. In fact, that the experts had accepted 6 forgeries as genuine works by the master was devastating for the reputation of the Dutch art establishment. Following Van Meegeren's confession during his interrogation of 1945, the court ordered him to paint a similar forgery, a painting, to demonstrate that he had forged these works. So Van Meegeren, under close supervision, then painted Jesus among the doctors. As a result, collaboration charges were dropped at his trial in 1947, and Van Meegeren is found guilty of forgery and fraud and sentenced to 1 year in prison. He died shortly thereafter. And here, so here obviously is the Supper of Emmaus. So there's the painting he painted for the court orders. That painting, and this is the court, we saw this image earlier. You probably from your seats can't see this, but up here in the background, maybe you can make out this figure that's the painting. This painting that he painted at that moment is there, but the Supper of Emmaus is over here. So this photograph shows some of the story that we've been discussing so far tonight. After the Van Meegeren Affair, that's just how de Vries called it, Dutch scholars, including de Vries, immediately began to reassess their views on Vermeer. In December 1947, less than a month after the conclusion of the trial, de Vries revised his Vermeer monograph, in which he explained why he had previously accepted the Supper of Emmaus. De Vries noted that he had been deceived because no one had ever painted such a creative type of forgery. Instead of adopting a pre-existing work for his forgery, such as the ones that we saw earlier with the lace maker and the smiling girl, Van Meegeren produced a type of painting that Vermeer had never actually made. But everybody thought he probably would have. Because of his disillusion, is the word he used, that he experienced after the Van Meegeren Affair, de Vries decided to look critically at the entirety of Vermeer's oeuvre and to prune away paintings whose authenticity he could no longer confirm. Among the 45 works he previously had accepted but now eliminated from Vermeer's oeuvre were forgeries, including Lace Maker and A Smiling Girl, but also the so-called Greta Garbo Vermeer, which Linda McKay is written wonderfully about. It used to be owned by Ringling. Although de Vries did not deem Woman Seated the Virginal, which he had previously accepted to be a forgery, he now proposed that it had been executed around 1800 in the style of a 17th century painting. The Van Meegeren Affair thus had a far-reaching impact, sometimes positive and sometimes negative, on the Vermeer studies. It forced scholars to look critically at recently discovered Vermeers, some of which were forgeries. But it also created an overly restricted view of Vermeer's genius, with the consequence that authentic Vermeers were also wrongly eliminated from his oeuvre. And the young woman, see the Virginal, is but one of those. De Vries' decision to reject Vermeer's attribution of young woman seated at the Virginal had a direct impact on subsequent opinions about the work that have lasted until recent years. His negative assessment include other scholars who were writing Vermeer monographs during the 1950s. Moreover, who also rejected it as a result of what de Vries had said. Moreover, after Alfred Lane Beit, who had inherited the painting in 1946, decided to sell it, de Vries's doubts also discouraged potential buyers from acquiring the painting. In 1957, the London art dealer whom Beit had enlisted to sell Young Women See the Virginal decided to clean the painting prior to bringing it to The Hague for de Vries to re-examine. After de Vries studied the painting that November, he wrote the dealer that he was now convinced about its attribution to Vermeer. At the same time, de Vries wrote a fascinating letter to Alfred Beit in June 1958 to explain why he had doubted the painting in the revised edition of his Vermeer monograph. And Ann Willett from the Getty recently sent us this wonderful letter that de Vries wrote to Beit, and I thank her for that. And the letter reads in part, after the Van Meegeren fake affair, he wrote, I became very cautious and expressed doubts, however, without having seen it again in the original. Now, however, after having seen the painting's very successful restoration and having received new technical information, he was strengthened in his belief that Vermeer had executed the painting. Unfortunately, de Vries never revised his 1948 monograph, and hence never published his newly positive assessment of the painting's attribution. In 1959, Lawrence Gowing examined the painting after its recent restoration, the one de Vries had seen, and like de Vries, he was convinced that the attribution to Vermeer was correct, concluding that it was the last painting we have from Vermeer's hand. After these positive verbal assessments, the London dealer who was working for Beit successfully sold the painting in 1960 to the Brussels collector dealer Baron Frederick Rollin. Baron Rollin soon enlisted, he lived the painting for a short while, but then decided he would like to sell it. But he was unsuccessful. There's a whole long story here I just took out, thinking, okay, we don't need to go into that anyhow. So as a result, it stayed with him, Baron Rollin, in Brussels for the next 20 years, where it remained largely unavailable to scholars and rarely mentioned in the literature. Albert Blanquet, for example, did not mention it in his important monograph, and I did mention it briefly in text, but did not accept its attribution, I should say. Very much under the sway of the Van Meegeren world still. In 1990s, Baron Rollin asked Gregory Rubinstein of Sotheby's to undertake a thorough assessment of Young Women See the Virginal. A team of scholars under the leadership of Libby Sheldon conducted technical examinations that yielded important discoveries about Vermeer's materials and techniques, as well as a significant compositional change. And I'm showing here an X-radiograph, which may be hard to read from your seats, but the X-radiograph revealed that there was an underlying yellow outfit beneath the woman's yellow shawl. And perhaps you can see there's see that dark area there? That is a fold in the underlying, all these are folds in the underlying fabric. It was painted lead tin yellow. And they're different than the folds you see in the shawl over that's now visible. So that information from the X-ray said, oh my gosh, there's a whole other shawl underneath, a whole other cloak underneath the shawl. But it was also, they also discovered in their examination that the lead tin yellow that was used in the lower garment was different than the lead tin yellow used in the shawl, which means that they were not painted at the same time. And in fact, not only the lead tin yellow's different, but there was a layer of feldspar, which is probably a contaminant from Delftware production, that had settled between the two layers, while the work would lay uncovered in Vermeer's studio. That revelation indicates that the underlying garment and the yellow cloak were executed a few years apart. In 1996, at the invitation of Gregory Rubinstein at Sotheby's, and that's Greg Rubinstein here, I was invited to examine the young woman at the Virginal at the National Gallery in London, together with the two late Vermeers in that collection. And here, in viewing the paintings with Greg, who was actually my first intern at the National Gallery, I should say, and this is Baron Verlaine here. He was there too. This is David Bomford, who was a restorer, who was looking at the painting through a microscope. And there you can see the three paintings together. That was the first time I'd seen the painting, and the realization of how small it was hit me really strongly. I did not really appreciate that from looking at dimensions until then. It was, oh my God, this is really small, little painting. But we were all concluded that they're exactly by the same hand, Johannes Vermeer's hand. The other thing, in looking at it carefully and looking at that X-ray carefully, we came to the conclusion that the yellow underlying garment, if you go back to that shadow, that fold, is very similar to the same kind of fold you see in Vermeer's painting at Kenwood of the guitar player. And so that connection to this painting suggested that they probably began at about the same time, which was around 1670. This is probably gave a date for this painting based on the connections in the underlying garment of this painting. The stylistic connections between those works were reinforced by dating established by another technical examination, and that is analysis of thread counts in the painting's canvas. So thread counts, in the X-ray you can see, the vertical, the horizontal and vertical are all indications of threads, and there's a whole fascinating technique that's been developed in recent years by Richard Johnson and Don Johnson about measuring with X-rays, identifying and measuring these thread counts, and with that analysis, they determined that the Vermeer, the Leiden Collection, Vermeer and the lace maker in the Louvre were from the same bolt of cloth. And so the lace maker, like the Kenwood painting, dates around 1670. So another bit of information that suggests that this painting began, Vermeer began this painting around that time. In 2001, Baron Verlaine lent the painting, young woman, at the Virginal to an exhibition of Vermeer in the Delft School at the Met. And Walter Liedtke, wait a second, what happened to that? Here, okay. Walter Liedtke, former curator of the Met at the Met, curator of that exhibition, added the painting at the end of the installation, but only as an addendum and without giving it an attribution. So the uncertainties still were very much alive. In 2004, after more restorations had been done and removing disturbing old overpaint, Sotheby's sold the painting as a Vermeer to Steve Wynn, and subsequently Walter accepted the painting in his Vermeer monograph of 2008. In that same year, Thomas Kaplan acquired the painting for the Leiden Collection. Since then, the work has been frequently exhibited and widely acknowledged as one of the last paintings that the Delft master executed. Even with the restorations undertaken in the sale in 2004, recently it's become apparent that the appearance of young woman seated at the Virginal no longer reflected the luminous image that Vermeer had executed in Delft in the 1670s. To rectify these issues, we invited David Bull, one of the world's premier restorers, particularly of Vermeer paintings, to conserve the painting in 2024. And he's shown here in the middle, David with me and with Teresa Long here, his wife. David unfortunately passed away just a year or so ago. But these are images of the cleaned painting. This is the before restoration, and that's the woman's face after restoration, and that's her gaze before restoration. So David's touch transformed the painting's appearance, revealing once again the sensitivity of Vermeer's light on the wall, subtle reflections on the face of the Virginal, and the woman's gentle expression, which had been altered during the 2004 restoration. I don't know if you can tell, but she has now much warmer, sort of gentle little smile that had been somewhat lost when the painting had been previously restored from overpaint. Let's see. Here's larger images of the before and after. What had been discovered during the examination of the painting at that time is that the previous restorers had left on areas, a lot of areas were painted and maybe too much overpaint applied to minimize the craquelure patterns, but old varnish had not been removed on the face of the Virginal or on the woman's cloak, which made the shadows much heavier, much thicker, and it didn't. So once it was cleaned, they have more translucency, and the kind of folds. The folds work much more effectively as folds in and out of space. In fact, the earlier appearance of it was such, it felt so un-Vermeer-like that I doubted that Vermeer had done this, the cloak that had been applied after his death. But now, with the restoration, it's very clear that that is not the case. That is, it flows very much like a Vermeer robe should flow. One of the other, a couple of things that come about with this experience, particularly sitting there with this painting a lot, is that you can really fully experience, when you're up close to this painting, fully experience the quiet joy Vermeer has captured of a young woman in harmony with her music as she gently fingers the keyboard. The painting's small scale heightens its intimate character, and one can imagine it sitting on a favorite table or hanging in a private space where it could be quietly enjoyed. Unexpectedly, with the removal of the discolored varnish on the yellow cloak, it's now possible to distinguish where the upper paint layer overlapped the original yellow garment and where it extended over the gray paint of the wall. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's a kind of in the middle, right here, there's a kind of the yellowish, the shadows have you can see the yellowish character in the shaded areas, and in the back part, it's much darker without the yellow character, and that's over the wall and where it's over the yellow garment underneath. And it's a kind of a straight line in there that you can see. It was very interesting to realize this, that her position, see the position at the instrument is very much the same way of the seated position of the woman in Braunschweig, and actually the seated woman at the National Gallery in London, which is about the same time as the Vermeer painting. So it sort of gave us a new sense of how Vermeer's woman actually had sat, and the way she sits with a straight back and her neck and head slightly forward. I mean, it all is very consistent with that character of the modeling that he has in other paintings. Although Vermeer likely began this painting in the early 1670s, the stylistic evidence that we talked about indicates he added the shawl much later, probably around 1673, 75, at the time he painted the woman in London. In that painting, Vermeer modeled the fabric of the woman's dress in much a similar manner as the shawl, in the way he juxtaposes highlights with sweeping folds of the woman's blue dress with deep pockets of shade. The gap in time between when Vermeer initially painted young woman seated at the Virginal and when he added the yellow shawl can likely be explained by the impact of the devastating Rampjaar, or disaster year, of 1672. The hostilities during the invasion of the Netherlands by French and German forces negatively affected the art market. Following Vermeer's death in December 1675, the artist's widow, Catharina Bons, lamented that her husband had been able to earn very little or hardly anything at all because of the war with the King of France. Nevertheless, it seems unlikely that Vermeer stopped painting after 1672, as some have postulated. At his death, Vermeer left 10 painters' canvases, among other supplies, an indication that he was still active as a painter. The broad folds of the shawl reflect a style of dress that had become fashionable after the French invasion, but it also gives the woman a timeless classical look. Much as Gowing posited, Vermeer likely made his revisions to young women seated at the Virginal during the last years of his life. Whether he did so at his own initiative or because of a patron's request is a fascinating question that tantalizingly remains open. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. We now have time for any questions.
Fascinating talks. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, you just, in the later part of your talk, you talked about the painting having been cleaned. How was it cleaned?
I'm sorry.
How was it cleaned?
How was it cleaned?
Yes.
Very carefully. David Bull is a master. He cleaned all 4 Vermeers at the National Gallery, and before doing this, so he's cleaned 5 Vermeers, which is, I think, a world's record. And then he went with a very small brush, with incredible patience, and just small dots in to recreate or bring back the light qualities, the flow of light in the background. It was just small little touches, and he would stop and look at what was going on and do a few more touches and then stop. And so it was a process that went on for days and weeks for a little painting like that. It was just, and he knows Vermeer so well that it was a joy for him to work on this wonderful painting, and it was joy to me to be there while he was doing it. And I actually been involved with the restorations he did on the 4 gallery paintings too. So we've had a nice give and take about the things that we can expect and the kind of magic of contours and all the elements that the color and the nuances of color in his works. That it was a joy. To me, it's a very wonderful moment in my experiences with this painting.
Thank you again for a very good talk. Well, to piggyback on her question, since there's so much at stake and so much writing on these paintings, for instance, when something's cleaned or restored, are all these kind of separate interest and authorities kind of wandering in while a painting's being restored and cleaned and all that kind of stuff? Supervising it?
No, it was very quiet. So David did a lot. He wants it quiet. He wants it very quiet. And he always, so although I like working with him, I'm very cognizant of his desire to be cleaning by himself. And then he will work on it for a while, and then we would have a moment of sit and talk and discuss it, and then go have a cup of tea, and then he'd go back to work, and I'd go read a book, and then, So there are a lot of authorities that come and look at these things, but they are not there while David is working. Now, I don't know if that's always the case with other restorers of Vermeer paintings, but definitely that was the case with this particular instance. So at the National Gallery, we had a large lab, and there were multiple paintings being cleaned at the same time, but everybody was also cognizant of David's desire to be isolate himself in his own world when he's restoring. So I don't think he noticed when other people came in the room, and people knew not to ask him anything. Yes.
I was so fascinated by what you mentioned about there being a layer of contamination from Delftware factories that settled in between the paint layers. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and if that's something that you've seen in other paintings from Delft in this period?
I've never, there's feldspar is what it's called, and I have never heard of that happening in another painting. Though we do know that Vermeer did, I think it probably has not been examined. This painting had special extra technical examinations being done on, so it may exist elsewhere, but I don't know that that's the case. But we do know from Vermeer's paintings that there are many times when he had made changes in his compositions. And so what is the time frame of those, and how long does it sit before he decides to go back to it and revise it one way or the other? So it could well be, but I don't think it's been searched. This is a rather recent realization that this could exist, and I don't believe it's been widely explored. But finding layers of varnish on underlying layers, over the years, there are definitely ways that you can see that revisions have been done at some length of time after the original composition was done. And we know that from Rembrandt that there are you can see changes in the same way that you could with the Vermeer, in that the different combinations of pigments make up the paint layer, the same paint. So the yellows look different, and over time, often these different mixtures of paint, they looked the same at the 17th century, but over time they shift slightly so that you can see actually quite easily when these different layers have been added. Yeah.
I was just curious how far back the idea of forgeries goes, because we have in Rembrandt's time, he had workshops where they would do the same picture, or were those considered like trying to be sold as forgeries, or when does the concept?
I think forgeries go. Well, it's a complicated. How do you define a forgery? We know, for example, that collectors' cabinets in the 16th and 17th century always wanted to have these great works of art, but they were also eager to have copies of famous paintings. So now that's a forgery or that's not a forgery. I mean, how do you define a forgery? It's a little bit of a kind of interesting problem because to what extent are students, Rembrandt students, painting similar paintings to Rembrandt, done in the style of, and that was okay by Rembrandt, or were they unauthorized to do that, and were they meant to be understood to be the master's work? And now, to what extent is that the artist doing that? To what extent is that some later dealer, maybe not knowing or maybe consciously trying to sell something for more money by saying it was by the master? One interesting thing that I didn't get into at all was, of other Vermeers that were impacted by the Van Meegeren affair. That was one thing. The girl in the red hat was impacted for sure. But the fact that one of the first members of the Rembrandt Research Project worked in the Hoogdijk gallery in Amsterdam, where they sold a lot of Vermeers, forgeries, forged Vermeers, a lot of Van Meegerens. And he, after having had that experience, I think got together with other Dutch art historians and said, if it happens with Vermeer, why couldn't it happen to Rembrandt? So the beginnings of the Rembrandt Research Project really may also go back to the implications of the resulting sense of failure that the Dutch art historian community had as a result of accepting so many of these forgeries.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and you are welcome to join us in the Whitney up these stairs for refreshments.